The vastness of the high valley was a crushing weight, a sea of wind-rippled grass and unforgiving stone that stretched to the sharp, toothy peaks of the mountains. It was a place of silence, broken only by the lonesome cry of a hawk or the lowing of cattle from a distance too great to offer any comfort. Down a narrow dirt track, little more than a scar on the land made by wagon wheels and stubborn hope, a solitary figure moved. She was a smudge of faded blue against the golden expanse, a tremor of life in a landscape that seemed to breathe with a slow, ancient indifference. This was Lin. Each step was a small battle won, a painful negotiation between her will and the sickness that had taken root deep within her chest. A dry, rattling cough escaped her lips, a sound that had become the constant rhythm of her days. Her feet, wrapped in thin-soled shoes, were numb with dust and cold. She had been walking for weeks, a journey born of pure desperation after a fever had taken the last of her family, leaving her alone in a world that had no place for a frail, unmarried woman. Her village was a fading memory, a place of closed doors and averted eyes once her strength had failed. Ahead, a fence line appeared, a long, serpentine boundary of split logs that spoke of immense labor and a claim upon this wild land. Beyond it, at the foot of a sheltering pine-covered slope, sat a ranch. It was not grand, but it was solid. A cabin of honey-colored logs with a sturdy chimney, a corral, and a large barn that promised hay and animals and life. To Lin, it was a vision of impossible safety. Her hope, a frail and flickering thing, sparked once more. Perhaps here, she could find a corner in a barn, a single meal in return for mending a pile of clothes or scrubbing a pot. She did not dare hope for more. She pushed open the heavy wooden gate, its iron hinge groaning a protest that shattered the valley's quiet. The sound brought a man out from the shadowy interior of the barn. He stood tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by sun and wind into a map of quiet endurance. This was Jian. He did not speak, his dark eyes taking in the sight of her, the unnatural pallor of her skin, the way her thin frame seemed to sway like a sapling in the breeze, the deep shadows of exhaustion beneath her eyes. Lin's courage almost failed her. She clutched the worn fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. "Please, sir," she began, her voice a threadbare whisper. I cannot stay out in the cold." A new fit of coughing seized her, bending her double and leaving her breathless and ashamed. When she could speak again, she forced the words out, the most honest and humbling confession of her life. "I am too sick to cook or work for long." Jian watched her, his expression unreadable. He saw the truth of her words in the tremble of her hands and the hollows of her cheeks. He was a man who understood survival, the simple, brutal mathematics of the seasons. The air already held a sharp, metallic hint of the coming winter. A night out in the open, in her condition, would be a death sentence. He had lived alone for so long that silence was his native tongue, but the sight of this broken creature stirred something forgotten within him, a deep, instinctive need to protect. He took a slow step forward, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. His gaze was not one of pity, but of a practical, profound assessment. He saw not just a sick woman, but a person with a will strong enough to have walked this far. In his mind, the solution was as simple and straightforward as the land he worked. He would not offer her a night's shelter, that was a delay, not an answer. He would offer her a foundation. "Then marry me," he said, his voice low and steady, the words dropping into the silence between them like smooth stones into a deep pond. The world seemed to stop for Lin. The wind, the distant call of the hawk, the very beating of her own heart, all of it stilled. She stared at him, certain the fever and hunger were making her hear things. He saw her confusion and continued, his explanation plain and without poetry. "As my wife, this is your home. The roof is strong, the fire is warm. There will be food and a safe place to rest. You can heal. He paused, his eyes holding hers. I do not ask for a strong worker. I ask for a companion. It is a better thing than to be alone. Lin looked from his earnest, weathered face to the solid cabin, then back again. It was madness. It was a transaction, a bargain struck in a moment of utter need. But in his eyes, she saw not a trap, but a refuge. It was a lifeline thrown to her in a stormy sea, and she was too tired, too sick, and too desperate to do anything but grasp it with both hands. She gave a single, slow nod, a silent agreement that would change the course of both their lives forever. The heavy wooden door of the cabin closed behind Lin with a soft, final thud, sealing out the vast, indifferent world and enclosing her in a dim, silent space that smelled of pine smoke and dried herbs. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her back against the rough-hewn planks, her body trembling not from cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming shock of what she had just done. She had traded her name, her future, her very self, for the promise of 4 walls and a roof. The man, Jian, moved past her with a quiet respect, giving her a wide berth as if understanding the fragile bubble of her existence. The inside of the cabin was a reflection of the man himself, simple, sturdy, and functional, yet possessing a quiet order. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and filled with old ash. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, and a single bunk with a thin mattress was tucked into a corner. There were no curtains on the single small window, no decorations on the walls save for a worn leather harness hanging from a peg. It was the home of someone who lived inside his own thoughts, a place for shelter, not for living. Jian, wordlessly, began to build a fire. He worked with an efficient grace, arranging the kindling and logs until a small, bright flame sparked to life, greedily licking at the dry wood. The growing light pushed back the shadows in the room, and with them, a small measure of the deep-seated chill that had taken root in Lin's bones. He then turned to the bunk, pulling out a folded wool blanket from a chest. It was thick and scratchy, but it looked clean and warm. "This is for you," he said, his voice low. "I will sleep by the fire." It was not a suggestion, but a statement of fact, and Lin understood it for what it was, a gift of space, a boundary drawn for her comfort and his. He was giving her a territory that was hers alone. She took the blanket, her fingers tracing the coarse weave, and nodded her thanks, her voice still trapped somewhere deep inside her, lost in the fog of her illness and the strangeness of it all. The first days passed in a quiet, cautious dance. Jian would rise before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her, and slip out to tend to his animals and the endless work of the ranch. Lin would wake to the profound silence of the empty cabin, the only sound the crackle of the fire he had always left burning for her. Her body was still a prison of weakness, a simple walk from the bed to the table could leave her breathless, a spell of coughing racking her thin frame. But with each spoonful of the simple broth he prepared, with each day of warmth and uninterrupted rest, a tiny seed of strength began to stir within her. A week after her arrival, she felt a small, persistent urge to do something, to contribute. She saw one of Jian's work shirts draped over a chair, its sleeve torn cleanly at the seam. Finding a needle and a spool of sturdy thread in a small tin on the mantel, she sat by the window for the light and began to mend it. Her hands, once skilled at fine embroidery, were clumsy and weak, but she focused all her will on the task. The simple, repetitive motion of pushing the needle through the thick fabric was a meditation, a reacquaintance with her own hands. When the tear was closed, the seam a little crooked but strong, she felt a flicker of accomplishment, the first in a very long time. She did not mention it, simply placing the mended shirt back where she found it. The next evening, when Jian came in from the fields, he picked it up. He did not look at her, but she saw his fingers trace the new stitches, a slow, considering movement. He said nothing, but when he sat down to the simple meal of stew he had made, he looked at her and gave a single, slow nod. It was a tiny thing, a mere dip of his chin, but to Lin, it felt like a burst of sunshine. This small success gave her courage. The next day, she swept the hard-packed earthen floor with a brittle straw broom, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. She attempted to bake flatbread from the flour and salt she found, the first batch burning at the edges, the second coming out pale and doughy. She placed the least offensive piece on a plate for him, her heart thumping with a nervousness that felt both foolish and profound. Jian broke the bread, ate it without comment, and then, to her astonishment, he spoke. "It is good," he said. And then, after a pause, "The floor is clean." They were the most ordinary words, but in the quiet of the cabin, they were like music. It was the beginning of their language, a vocabulary built not on grand speeches, but on mended seams and swept floors. One afternoon, he returned from checking his traps near the stream that cut through the lower pasture. He walked to the table where Lin was sitting and opened his calloused hand. On his palm lay a small cluster of wildflowers, their petals a delicate, sky blue. They were a little wilted from his grasp, but their color was a vibrant shock in the monochrome world of the cabin. "For you," he said, placing them gently on the wood before her. Lin stared at the flowers, then up at his retreating back as he went to wash up. There was no practical reason for them. They could not be eaten, they provided no warmth, they served no purpose at all. And that was the point. It was the first thing he had given her that was not for survival. It was a gift, plain and simple. She carefully placed them in a small clay cup of water, her heart feeling strangely, wonderfully full. That night, after their quiet meal, he did not immediately retreat into his own thoughts. Instead, he began to speak, his voice a low rumble in the firelit room. He told her of the long, solitary winters, of the stubbornness of the mountain soil, of a cow that had once gotten lost for a week and returned on its own. She, in turn, her voice gaining a little strength, spoke of the seaside village of her childhood, the smell of salt and the sound of gulls, a memory she had not dared to visit in months. They did not look at each other, but stared into the flames, their words weaving a fragile bridge between their two solitary lives. The trust between them was no longer just a bargain or a necessity, it was a living thing, taking root in the shared silence and the slowly spoken stories, growing stronger with each passing day in the high, lonely valley. The fragile peace they had woven, thread by careful thread, was first challenged by a subtle shift in the wind. It began as a whisper, a new, sharper edge to the air that carried the scent of frozen earth and distant snow. Jian, whose life was dictated by such signs, grew quieter still, his eyes often turning towards the brooding peaks. He spent the days reinforcing the barn door, piling extra firewood against the cabin wall until it formed a dense, log fortress, and checking the latches on the shutters. Lin watched his preparations with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. The memory of being exposed to the elements was still a fresh, cold scar on her soul. The storm did not creep in, it arrived with a roar. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a flat, iron gray, suddenly unleashed a furious, blinding whiteness. The wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, shaking the shutters and hurling fistfuls of snow against the window like a relentless enemy. The world beyond the thick log walls vanished, swallowed by a churning, howling chaos. Inside, the fire in the hearth, which had always been a source of gentle comfort, now seemed a small, defiant spark against an immense, crushing darkness. Jian pulled on his heavy coat, its fleece lining turned inward, and wrapped a thick scarf around his face. "I must see to the animals," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "The snow will drift. They could be trapped, or the roof could fail." Lin's heart clenched with a fear that was entirely new, a sharp, personal terror that was solely for him. The man who had been her quiet, solid protector was about to step into a whiteness that felt alive and malevolent. She wanted to beg him not to go, to let the animals fend for themselves, but she knew the value of a life, any life, on this land. She simply nodded, her hands clenched tightly in the folds of her skirt. He opened the door, and a blast of frozen air ripped through the cabin, making the fire gasp and sputter. For a moment, he was a dark silhouette against a wall of pure white, and then he was gone, the door slamming shut behind him, leaving Lin in a silence that was somehow more terrifying for the muffled fury outside. She rushed to the window, but she could see nothing. The storm was a solid, moving wall. Time stretched and warped. She fed the fire until it roared, its heat a palpable force against the cold seeping through the logs. She paced the small space, her ear tuned to any sound beyond the wind's constant shriek, listening for a sound that did not come. An eternity seemed to pass before a heavy thud against the door made her jump. She rushed to unbar it, heaving it open against the wind. Jian half fell inside, his body a sculpture of ice and snow. His eyelashes were frozen white, his coat stiff and crackling, and his breath came in ragged, painful-sounding gasps. He stumbled towards the fire, his movements clumsy and slow. Without a word, Lin was there. Her own weakness, her own sickness, was forgotten, burned away by the urgent need to act. Her fingers, now steadier and stronger, worked at the frozen buttons of his coat, her touch firm and sure. She pulled the icy weight from his shoulders, then his gloves, chafing his stiff, reddened hands between her own to restore the circulation. She guided him to the chair closest to the hearth and brought him a cup of hot tea she had kept steeping, wrapping his unfeeling fingers around the warm clay. She knelt and pulled off his frozen boots, setting them near the fire to dry. She was a whirl of quiet, efficient motion, a caretaker where she had so recently been the one cared for. Jian sat, silent and spent, his body shuddering as the deep cold slowly released its grip. He watched her, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight, and in them was a look she had never seen before, not gratitude, but something deeper, a raw and profound wonder. As the heat returned to his limbs and the color to his face, the tension of the ordeal began to melt away, leaving in its wake a new and powerful quiet. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the cabin felt like the only safe, warm place in all of creation. They were its sole inhabitants, a tiny island of life in a sea of white fury. Jian looked at Lin, who was now sitting on the floor near his feet, her arms wrapped around her knees, watching the flames. "I was lonely before you came," he said, the words simple and unadorned, yet they seemed to hang in the air, more real and solid than any of the logs in the walls. It was not a complaint, but a confession, an acknowledgement of a hollow space in his life that he had simply learned to endure. Lin looked up at him, the firelight softening the lines of his weary face. She thought of her own journey, the crushing loneliness of being sick and unwanted, a ghost in her own life. "So was I," she whispered back. In that moment, the last invisible wall between them crumbled into dust. The bargain they had struck at the gate was gone, replaced by something that had grown slowly and surely in the shared space between silence and storm. They were no longer a rancher and a sick woman bound by a desperate agreement. They were Jian and Lin, two people who had chosen to face the tempest together, and in doing so, had found they were no longer alone in the world. The fire crackled, the wind moaned, but inside the cabin, there was only the profound, peaceful silence of a promise finally, fully understood. The great storm, having spent its fury, retreated from the high valley, leaving behind a world transformed. A blanket of deep, unbroken white lay over the land, so brilliant under the returning sun it hurt the eyes. The silence outside was now a peaceful one, a hushed and respectful quiet. But inside the cabin, a different kind of transformation had taken root, one that was quieter and far more profound. The air between Jian and Lin, once filled with the careful distance of strangers, now hummed with a new and unspoken understanding. The confession in the firelight had been a key, turning a lock deep within them both, and a door had swung open onto a new landscape of their lives together. Their daily routines continued, the rhythm of their work unchanged, but every movement, every glance, was now imbued with a new and tender significance. When Jian came in from the cold, his hands stiff from work, Lin would take them in her own without a word, her warmth seeping into his skin. Her touch was no longer just that of a caretaker, but of a woman offering comfort to her man. When she reached for a pot on a high shelf, he would be there, his presence solid behind her, his hand gently brushing her arm as he retrieved it for her. The space around them seemed to have shrunk, drawing them into a closer orbit, and neither sought to pull away. One evening, as Lin sat by the hearth weaving a new broom from dried rushes, Jian came and sat beside her on the floor. He did not speak, but simply watched her hands, their movements deft and sure, a testament to the strength that had returned to her. The fire painted her face in warm tones of gold and orange, and he saw not the pale, sickly woman from the gate, but the person who had mended his shirt, who had faced the storm with him, who had filled his silent house with the soft sounds of life. He reached out, his work-roughened fingers, usually so sure with rope and axe, trembling almost imperceptibly as they covered her hand, stilling its motion. Lin's breath caught in her throat. She looked down at their hands, his large and dark and weathered, hers small and pale nestled within its shelter. Then she lifted her gaze to meet his. There were no words needed. In the deep, quiet pools of his eyes, she saw a question, and in her own, she gave the answer. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, but she did not. Their first kiss was not a collision of passion, but a slow, gentle meeting, a seal upon the promises they had already made with their lives. It was as soft as the touch of a moth's wing, yet it sent a current through them both, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. When they parted, the world felt remade, the very air in the cabin now theirs, and theirs alone. This new intimacy bloomed in the quiet of their mountain home, a natural and tender progression of their shared life. Their nights, once spent in separate spaces across a dark room, now became a private world of discovery. In the deep, velvety darkness of the cabin, under the thick wool blankets, they learned the landscape of each other. His touch was patient and reverent, as if he were handling something precious he had long thought lost. Her responses were shy at first, then trusting, then eager, her own hands learning the hard planes of his back, the strength in his shoulders. It was a silent language of breath and touch, a conversation more honest than any words could ever be. It was not about wild desire, but about a profound closeness, a joining that was as much about the spirit as it was about the body. In these quiet hours, the last vestiges of their former loneliness were burned away, replaced by a deep, abiding knowledge that they were, in every sense that mattered, one. The next morning, as the first light of dawn tinted the snow outside a soft pearl gray, Lin awoke not to an empty space, but to the solid, warm reality of Jian beside her. He was already awake, his head propped on his hand, simply watching her sleep. A slow, deep smile spread across his face, a sight so rare and beautiful it made her heart ache with joy. She smiled back, her hand reaching out to find his. There was no shyness, only a settled, peaceful certainty. The cabin was no longer just a shelter from the storm. It was a sanctuary, a world entire, built not of logs and mortar, but of trust, and care, and a love that had been quietly growing all along, waiting for the season to be right to finally, fully, bloom. The relentless grip of winter began to loosen its hold, not with a sudden shout, but with a slow, quiet sigh. The deep, crusted snow retreated from the cabin's foundation, revealing dark, damp earth. The stream, so long imprisoned under a lid of ice, began to sing again, its voice a cheerful gurgle that echoed through the still leafless trees. Inside the cabin, the change was just as profound, but it was a change of warmth and light. Lin no longer moved with the careful, pained steps of a ghost. Her cheeks, once pale as the winter moon, now carried the soft blush of the wild roses that would soon bloom on the hillside. Her laughter, once a forgotten sound, now filled the small space, a melody that Jian would stop his work to listen to, a private smile touching his lips. This new vitality bloomed into a restless energy. One morning, she stood at the window, watching a patch of sunlight move across the bare ground. An idea, small and determined, had taken root in her heart. She found a stout piece of wood and, using one of Jian's heavy tools, began to break the cold, resistant soil just outside their door. Jian watched her from the barn, her figure bent with purpose. He did not ask what she was doing, he simply came over later, his own spade in hand, and began to turn the earth alongside her, his greater strength breaking through the tough sod where hers could not. Together, in silent partnership, they carved out a small, neat plot of land. It was Lin's garden. She planted seeds she had traded for in the distant village during one of their rare supply trips, seeds for practical things like squash and beans, but also, tucked into a corner, a few precious seeds for flowers. This garden was more than a source of food, it was a statement. It was a promise of future harvests, a symbol of a life not just endured, but cultivated and cherished. Weeks turned into months, and the high valley exploded into a riot of green and gold. The garden thrived under Lin's care, but a new and different kind of growth was happening within her. A profound tiredness would come over her in the afternoons, and the smell of certain foods would send a strange ripple through her stomach. She knew the signs, a deep, ancient knowledge that stirred within her. One evening, as they sat on the bench outside their cabin watching the stars pierce the velvet sky, she took Jian's hand and placed it gently on her belly, which had just begun to curve with a new, soft firmness. She did not need to say the words. The feeling beneath his palm, the profound and wondrous truth of it, traveled up his arm and straight into his heart. His breath caught, and his eyes, when he turned to look at her, shone with a moisture that reflected the starlight. He, a man of so few words, was rendered utterly speechless. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that was almost reverence. The lonely rancher who had offered a home to a dying stranger and the woman who had arrived with nothing but sickness and despair had created this, a new life, a testament to their shared resilience, their hard-won trust, and the quiet, abiding love that had saved them both. The ranch was no longer just a piece of land to be worked. It was a legacy. Every log of the cabin, every furrow in the garden, every animal in the barn was now part of a story that would continue. They stood together, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against him, looking out at the land that was their past, their present, and their future. The high valley was no longer a place of isolation, but a cradle of hope, a sanctuary they had built with their own hands and hearts. Did this story of quiet strength and blossoming love in a distant land capture your heart? If you yearn to discover more tales of resilience and romance from times gone by, we invite you to join our community. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you never miss the next journey into a world where love is the greatest strength of all.